What if I told you that the single most controversial device in the history of drag racing wasn't a nitro engine or a supercharger, but a $50 pile of junk that an 18-year-old kid scraped together from a harsh Indiana winter and a trip to Radio Shack? It sounds ridiculous, but this is the story of how a teenager broke the sport. This is Legacy Motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the weird, untold history of speed. If you're someone who loves the engineering behind the horsepower and the stories that changed racing forever, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to understand why this specific invention matters, you have to understand the landscape of 1987. We aren't talking about the polished corporate world of NHRA drag racing where teams have million-dollar data acquisition systems and weather stations that predict air density to the fourth decimal point. We're talking grassroots, gritty, Friday night test and tune sessions in central Indiana. The air smells like unburnt hydrocarbons and cheap hot dog water. The track surface is sticky, the lights are dim, and the guys running these cars are working blue-collar jobs all week just to blow their paychecks on tires and fuel. It was a simpler time, but it was also a time of massive frustration for a specific type of racer. You see, bracket racing was supposed to be the great equalizer. That was the pitch. It didn't matter if you had a $10,000 big block Chevy or your mom's grocery getter station wagon. The rules were designed so that anyone could win if they were consistent. Here's the thing about bracket racing that most people outside the sport don't realize. It is effectively a math problem solved at 100 miles per hour. You predict exactly how fast your car will go. That's your dial-in. If you say you're going to run the quarter mile in 12 seconds flat, you have to run as close to 12 seconds flat as humanly possible. If you run a 12.01, you are a hero. If you run an 11.99, you are a loser. You broke out. You went too fast. It is the only racing discipline on Earth where going too fast is actually a penalty. And this created a weird paradox. The guys with the slow cars, the 16-second pickups, the stock Mustangs, the daily drivers, actually had a massive advantage. Their cars were boringly consistent. They launched soft, they shifted slow, and they ran the exact same number every single time. But the fast guys? The guys with the built engines, the high compression pistons, the aggressive cams, they were in trouble. Imagine trying to sprint as fast as you can, but you have to cross the finish line at exactly 10.0 seconds. Not 9.9, not 10.1. Exactly 10. And you have to do this while a minivan next to you gets a 5-second head start. That was the reality for the fast bracket racers. They were chasing slower cars, and if their engines made just a little too much power because the air got cooler, they would break out and lose. So the fast guys developed this technique called foot throttling, and honestly, it was kind of insane. It was this primitive manual way of slowing a fast car down to make it consistent. You would launch the car as hard as possible to get a good reaction time, but then, somewhere around the 300-foot mark, you would physically lift your foot off the gas pedal. You'd coast. You'd literally let the engine drag the car down, watching the other lane, calculating the distance, and then at the last possible second, you'd stop the gas back to the floor to race to the stripe. Think about the coordination that requires. You are strapped into a vibrating metal box screaming at 6,000 RPM. You're experiencing G-forces pushing you back into the seat. And in the middle of this chaos, you have to have the delicate touch of a surgeon to lift your foot halfway, hold it, and get back on it at the exact right millisecond. It was an art form. The best guys, the veterans who had been racing since the 60s, were masters at it. They could feel the track. They knew that if the sun went behind the cloud, the track temp dropped 5 degrees, so they needed to lift for maybe an extra tenth of a second. It was all feel. It was all instinct. And for an 18-year-old kid trying to break into the sport, it was an absolute nightmare. Now, you might be thinking, why not just detune the engine? Why build a fast car if you have to slow it down? Well, because we are car guys. We don't build engines to go slow, we build them to make power. And in bracket racing, you still need that power to chase down the slower guy at the end of the track. You need the miles per hour to judge the finish line. So you had these overpowered cars trying to act like scooters for half the track. Our protagonist, let's call him the Indiana Kid to keep his identity private since he's still around, was driving a beat-up 1979 Camaro. It wasn't a show car. It was a primer gray bruise of a vehicle with a built 350 small block that had no business being that fast on a teenager's budget. He had spent every dime he made bagging groceries on cylinder heads and intake manifolds. The car was capable of running low 11s, which in 1987 was properly quick for a street car. But in the bracket classes he could afford to enter, he was constantly matched up against guys dialing 14 or 15 seconds. He tried foot throttling, he really did. He would go out there on a Thursday night and practice lifting. But here's the problem with human biology. We're terrible at being consistent clocks. One run, he'd be pumped up on adrenaline because he was racing a rival, and his foot would stay down a split second too long. Boom, breakout. The next run, he'd be overthinking it, lift too early, scrub too much speed, and get passed by a Dodge Dart running on 6 cylinders. It was humiliating. He knew his car was mechanically sound. He knew the engine was making the power, but the weak link in the chain was his right foot. The veterans loved it. They would see this kid pull up in the staging lanes, hear that nasty cam lope, and smile. They knew he was going to beat himself. They knew he didn't have the seat time to execute a perfect foot brake run. This is where most people would just quit or sell the car. But this kid had a different kind of brain. He wasn't just a driver, he was a tinkerer. He grew up taking apart radios and lawnmowers. And one afternoon, while he was frustratedly wrenching on his carburetor in his dad's garage, he noticed something. The car had factory air conditioning, and on the side of the carburetor, there was this little solenoid. For those who don't know, in old carbureted cars, when you turned on the AC, the compressor put a load on the engine that would make it stall at idle. So the factory installed a throttle kicker, or an idle solenoid. When the AC clicked on, this magnet would pop out and push the throttle open just a tiny bit to bump up the idle speed. It was a simple, dumb mechanical device, but as he stared at it, the gears in his head started turning. He pushed the solenoid plunger in and out. Click, click, click. It was instant. It was repeatable. It didn't have adrenaline. It didn't have a bad day. It just did exactly what it was told every single time. And that is when the question hit him. What if he could use this dumb little magnet to do the foot throttling for him? What if, instead of trusting his shaky ankle to lift off the gas, he could make a machine do it? The idea was so simple it was almost insulting. He didn't need to reinvent the engine, he just needed to interrupt the driver. But he didn't have money for custom fabrication. He had $50 and a relentless obsession with proving the old guys wrong. So he went to the local junkyard. He found a 1982 Oldsmobile Delta 88, a giant land yacht of a car, and ripped a vacuum solenoid off its emission system. Cost him $5. Then he went to Radio Shack. And that is when the question hit him. What if he could use this dumb little magnet to do the foot throttling for him? What if, instead of trusting his shaky ankle to lift off the gas, he could make a machine do it? The idea was so simple it was almost insulting. He didn't need to reinvent the engine, he just needed to interrupt the driver. But he didn't have money for custom fabrication. He had $50 and a relentless obsession with proving the old guys wrong. So he went to the local junkyard. He found a 1982 Oldsmobile Delta 88, a giant land yacht of a car, and ripped a vacuum solenoid off its emission system. Cost him $5. Then he went to Radio Shack. Now, for the younger viewers, Radio Shack was this magical place where you could buy resistors, capacitors, and project boxes to build literal robots. He bought a simple 12-volt timer module. It was a crude little circuit board with a dial on it. You gave it power, and it would turn a switch on for a set amount of time. That was it. He took these parts back to the garage and started mocking it up. The concept was backward from the AC kicker. Instead of using the solenoid to push the throttle open, he rigged it up to pull the throttle closed. He fabricated a crude bracket out of scrap steel he found on the floor. He drilled some holes in the carburetor linkage. The idea was that he would launch the car with his foot mashed to the floor, full throttle, butterflies wide open. Then the timer would activate. It would trigger the solenoid, which would physically yank the throttle linkage back, closing the carburetor blades to about 40%. It would hold it there, choking the engine, for exactly the amount of time he dialed in on the Radio Shack timer. Then the timer would click off, the solenoid would let go, and the springs would snap the throttle back to wide open. It was crude. It looked like something Doc Brown built in a fever dream. Wires were taped together, the bracket was ugly, but on the jack stands in the garage, it worked. Click, throttle closes. Click, throttle opens. He sat in the driver's seat and tested it. He didn't have to lift his foot. He could keep his leg locked straight, muscles tense, completely removing the human variable of how much do I lift. The machine set the throttle position. The machine set the duration. All he had to do was drive. This was the moment everything changed, though nobody knew it yet. He wasn't just building a car part, he was building the first rudimentary autopilot for drag racing. He was about to introduce digital logic to an analog sport. And the best part? He had no idea if it was actually going to work under load. A garage test is one thing. A quarter-mile pass at 110 miles per hour is a completely different animal. But he loaded the Camaro up on the trailer and headed to the track, ready to unleash this Frankenstein creation on a field of unsuspecting veterans who thought they had him figured out. Now, picture this scene. It's a humid Thursday night in central Indiana. The cornfields surrounding the track are pitch black, but the staging lanes are bathed in these harsh, buzzing sodium vapor lights. The air is thick with the smell of burnt rubber and high-octane race fuel. Nobody is paying any attention to our kid in the primer gray Camaro. To the casual observer, he's just another teenager burning up his tires and wasting gas. He pulls up to the line for a practice run. He does his burnout, smoke pouring off the rear tires, cleans them off, and stages. Pre-stage bulb, stage bulb, the tree comes down. Green. He launches hard. The front end lifts up, the tires chirp, and the car screams out of the hole. But then, about 60 feet out, something weird happens. The engine note changes. It goes from a high-pitched scream to a dull, flat moan. The nose of the car drops. It looks for all the world like he just blew a transmission or lost fuel pressure. The track announcer probably started to say something about trouble in the left lane. But then, just as suddenly, the car wakes up. The nose lifts back up, the engine roars back to life, and he streaks through the trap at the end of the quarter mile. He drives back to the pits, pops the hood, tweaks a little dial on a black plastic box, and goes out to do it again. Launch, bog, surge, repeat. By his fifth run, he had dialed in the timer perfectly. He wasn't broken, he was calibrating. Saturday night rolls around, and the place is packed. Over 120 cars are entered in the bracket class. This is the big leagues for local racing. Our kid draws a tough opponent for the first round, a local legend driving a tube chassis dragster. This guy is a veteran. He has been racing brackets for 15 years. He has a delay box, a trans brake, and a car that is basically a purpose-built missile. He dials a 1020. Our kid dials a 1350. That means the Camaro gets a 3.3-second head start. In drag racing terms, that is an eternity. You could read a billboard in that time. The dragster driver is sitting in his cockpit, cool as a cucumber. He sees the beat-up Camaro next to him and thinks this is an easy win. He's raced 100 kids like this. He knows the kid will probably red light or break out trying to run too fast. The tree drops for the Camaro. Green light. The kid mashes the gas. The Camaro leaves hard. 3 seconds later, the tree drops for the dragster. The veteran launches, his front wheels carrying in the air, engine screaming at 8,000 RPM. He is chasing the kid down like a hawk hunting a field mouse. But then the dragster driver sees it. He's closing the gap, reeling the Camaro in, when suddenly the Camaro seems to die. The taillights get closer way faster than they should. The veteran thinks, got him, he broke. His years of experience kick in. He starts his foot throttle routine. He lifts off the gas, coasting, trying to time his finish so he doesn't break out. He thinks the race is over. He thinks the kid's engine just quit. But he is wrong, dead wrong. At the 1,000-foot mark, the timer in the Camaro's glove box clicks off. The solenoid de-energizes. The spring snaps the throttle blade open. The Camaro, which had been lulling the veteran into a false sense of security, suddenly rockets forward with full power. The dragster driver is caught completely off guard. He slams his foot back down, but he hesitated. He coasted too long. Both cars cross the finish line in a blur. It looks like a dead heat. The wind light flashes in the Camaro's lane. The crowd is confused. The scoreboard tells the tale. The kid ran a 13.497 on a 1350 dial. He was 0.003 of a second under his target. Basically perfect. The dragster ran a 10.171 on a 1020 dial. He broke out by 29 thousandths. The kid won. Not because he was faster, but because he was a machine. The veteran climbs out of his dragster, ripping his helmet off. He is furious, but mostly he is confused. He marches over to the Camaro's pit. "What happened?" he demands. "I saw your car die. I saw it nose over. How did you get it back?" The kid, probably grinning like an idiot because he just beat the track champion, pops the hood. He points to the $5 Oldsmobile solenoid and the Radio Shack wires. "I didn't lift," he says. "The car did." The veteran stares at the engine bay. His face goes through a journey of emotions. First, confusion, then realization, then absolute shock, and finally, anger. "You can't do that," he says. That's cheating." But is it? Word spreads through the pits like wildfire. The kid has an autopilot. The kid has a robot driving his car. Within 20 minutes, there was a crowd of 30 people standing around the Camaro, staring at a vacuum solenoid like it's an alien artifact. Half of them think it's the most brilliant thing they have ever seen. The other half want to ban him for life. The track officials get involved. They drag out the 1987 NHRA rulebook. They flip through the pages. They look for rules about electronic throttle control. They look for rules about solenoids. There is nothing. The rulebook says you can't use electronic devices to control the transmission shifter or the transbrake release. It says absolutely nothing about the gas pedal. As far as the rules were concerned, the throttle was free real estate. The tech inspector looks at the device, looks at the rulebook, shrugs, and says, "It's legal." That ruling was the shot heard round the racing world. The kid went on to win the night. Every single round, his car would launch, bog down, surge, and run the number. It was mechanical clockwork. He didn't have to guess the wind. He didn't have to feel the track. He just let the timer do the work. He took home the trophy and the cash prize. But the real prize was what happened next. Drivers started coming up to him with cash in hand. "Build me one. I want that on my car next week." "How much?" The kid, realizing he had stumbled onto something massive, said, $50 plus parts. It was a steal. He spent the next week soldering wires in his bedroom. By the next race, he had built 23 of them. Think about the speed of that adoption. In 1 month, half the bracket class in central Indiana had these solenoids bolted to their carburetors. It changed the dynamic of the race instantly. Suddenly, the fast cars, the dragsters, the big block Chevelles, didn't have a disadvantage anymore. They could dial a 15-second time, use the throttle stop to kill 5 seconds of elapsed time, and hit their number perfectly. The slow cars, the minivans and station wagons that had dominated for years because of their consistency, were suddenly getting slaughtered. The fast cars were just as consistent now, but they had the power to run them down at the stripe. The playing field wasn't just leveled, it was inverted. The driver's skill of foot throttling was rendered obsolete overnight. Imagine spending 10 years perfecting your free throw shot, practicing every day, learning the arc, the backspin, the muscle memory, and then a guy walks onto the court with a robotic arm that shoots 100% from the line, and the referee says, "Yeah, that's legal." You would be furious, and the old guard racers were absolutely livid. They petitioned the track owners. They wrote angry letters to the sanctioning bodies. They threatened to boycott events. They argued that this wasn't racing anymore. It was programming. The controversy split the community right down the middle. On one side, you had the purists. They believed racing was about the connection between man and machine. If you take the man out of the loop, what is the point? You might as well just race spreadsheets. On the other side, you had the innovators. They argued that racing has always been about building a better mousetrap. If I can build a machine that is more consistent than your foot, that is not cheating. That is engineering. Why should I be penalized for having a fast car? Why should I have to drive worse on purpose just to compete? The debate raged in pit lanes and garages across the Midwest. But while they were arguing, the technology was evolving. The kid's $50 hack was just the Model T of throttle stops. Within 6 months, real engineering firms took notice. Companies like K&R Performance and Bear saw the potential. They realized that a vacuum solenoid from a junkyard was clever, but it wasn't precise enough for the national stage. Vacuum is affected by barometric pressure. It's slow to react. They knew they could do better. They started developing electric solenoids, digital timers, and CO2-powered rams. The arms race had officially begun. And what started as a way to help a teenager win a local bracket race was about to turn into a multi-million-dollar industry that would fundamentally alter the DNA of the sport. Here is the thing about innovation in racing. Once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't stuff it back in. You can ban it, you can regulate it, but you can't uninvent it. And the Throttle Stop was about to go from a garage hack to a polished professional product. By 1988, the companies that saw what was happening didn't just copy the kid's idea, they weaponized it. They looked at that vacuum solenoid and laughed. Vacuum is slow. Vacuum is inconsistent. If the engine load changes, vacuum changes. So they switched to electricity and compressed air. K&R Performance, a name that would become legendary in bracket racing circles, released the kit that made the kid's $50 setup look like a toy. Their system used a high-speed electric solenoid that could snap the throttle closed in milliseconds. It came with a digital timer box that wasn't from Radio Shack. This thing had quartz accuracy. It could time down to the thousandths of a second. But the real game changer was the introduction of CO2-powered throttle stops. Instead of relying on the car's own systems, these used a bottle of compressed carbon dioxide to fire a pneumatic ram. It was violent, it was instant, and it was terrifyingly consistent. Suddenly, you didn't just have an on-off switch, you had adjustability. The new controllers allowed you to set the exact percentage of throttle closure. You could program it to close to 50% or 20% or even 0% if you were crazy enough to risk stalling the engine. And you could do it in stages. The early timers were simple: launch, wait, close throttle, wait, open throttle, but the new digital boxes allowed for multi-stage strategies. You could launch hard to get a 60-foot time, close the throttle to settle the chassis, open it back up for the mid-track charge, and then, if you were really sophisticated, close it again right before the finish line to kill speed and keep from breaking out. This created a cottage industry that simply hadn't existed before. In 1986, a bracket racer's budget was tires, gas, and maybe some engine parts. By 1989, serious racers were dropping over $1,000 on electronics. A full throttle stop system with the CO2 bottle, the lines, the regulator, the solenoid, and the timer costs more than some of the engines in the class. And that was just the hardware. You needed a laptop to program the high-end stuff. We are talking about MS-DOS laptops in the pits of drag strips with guys who had never touched the computer in their lives trying to figure out baud rates and serial ports. It was a cultural collision of epic proportions. The driving style had to change completely, and this is where the psychological warfare began. For decades, racers had trained their brains to be sensitive to the car. If the car bogged, you pedaled it. If the tire spun, you lifted. Now they had to unlearn all of that. You had to launch the car, feel the engine die, feel the car nose over, and force yourself to keep your foot buried in the carpet. It was counterintuitive. It felt wrong. Every instinct in your body screamed that something was broken. The trust factor became the new currency. You weren't trusting your skill anymore, you were trusting a circuit board. And let me tell you, 1980s electronics were not exactly known for their reliability. Imagine being in the final round of a $10,000 race. You launch perfectly, the throttle stop engages, the car slows down, and then silence. The solenoid sticks, the timer glitches, the battery wire vibrates loose. You are now idling down the track at 30 miles per hour while your opponent disappears into the sunset. The failure rate was high in the beginning, and every failure was a public humiliation. There is a famous story from a division race in Illinois in 1990 that perfectly captures this new reality.
A racer had a brand new, top-of-the-line digital delay box. He was trying to program a 2.3-second throttle stop duration. Simple, right? But he fat-fingered the keypad. Instead of 2.3, he entered 23 seconds. He stages the car, green light, he launches. The throttle stop activates instantly. The car basically parks itself. He's rolling down the track at idle speed, watching the other guy finish the race, turn off the track, and probably grab a celebratory burger. And he's still rolling. The crowd thinks he broke a drive shaft. The announcer is confused. And then 23 agonizing seconds later, the timer finally clicks off. The car, which had just been idling along, suddenly screams to life and rockets through the traps at 140 miles per hour long after the race is over. He said later it was the longest 23 seconds of his life. But despite the failures, the math didn't lie. The cars with throttle stops were winning everything. The super classes, super comp, super gas, super street, became throttle stop classes by default. If you didn't have one, you were donating your entry fee. This led to a fascinating evolution in engine building. Before throttle stops, you built a bracket engine to be mild and consistent. You didn't want too much power because it was hard to control. But now you could build a monster. You could build an 800 horsepower big block Chevy that was capable of running 8-second quarters, and then use the throttle stop to strangle it down to a 1090 index. Why would you do that? Because a high horsepower engine restricted to run slow is incredibly consistent. It's not working hard, it's barely breaking a sweat. Plus, you get the massive miles per hour at the finish line. You could have a car that runs the first half of the track like a minivan and the second half like a funny car. This created closing speed issues that terrified track operators. You'd have a throttle stop car doing 160 miles per hour chasing down a slower car doing 110. The closing rates were insane. When that throttle stop released and 800 horsepower hit the tires at the 1,000-foot mark, the car would lurch forward like it had been rear-ended. It forced the tracks and the sanctioning bodies to react. The NHRA, always slow to change, didn't know what to do. First, they allowed them. Then they restricted them. Then they banned them in certain classes. It was a game of whack-a-mole. Tracks had to extend their shutdown areas because these cars were coming through the traps so fast. Insurance companies started asking questions. Wait, you have computerized cars doing 150 in a bracket race? Premiums went up. Safety equipment rules got stricter. But the biggest shift was philosophical. The sport had fundamentally changed from a test of driver reflexes to a test of setup and strategy. The race wasn't won on the track anymore, it was won in the pits. It was won by the guy who could look at his weather station, see that the air density had dropped 2%, and know exactly how many thousandths of a second to add to his timer. The driver became a passenger. His job was just to cut a good reaction time and steer straight. The machine did the heavy lifting. And this is where the resentment really set in. The old school guys, the ones who prided themselves on being able to foot brake a 10-second car to a dead-on run, felt like they were being pushed out. They called it checkbook racing. If you had the money for the best electronics, the best weather station, and the best throttle stop, you could beat a guy who had 10 times the talent but half the budget. It created a divide that still exists today. Go to any drag strip forum right now, type throttle stop, and watch the arguments explode. But here's the irony. The kid who invented it? He didn't make a dime off the industry he spawned. The concept was too simple to patent. You can't patent turning a switch on and off. So while companies were making millions selling these polished aluminum boxes, he was still back in Indiana tinkering in his garage. He wasn't bitter though. He knew he had changed the game. He had proven that you didn't need to be a professional driver to win. You just needed to be smarter than the problem. By 1995, throttle stop racing had become its own distinct art form. It was no longer just about slowing down. It was about managing the run. Racers started using data loggers to record drive shaft RPM, engine RPM, and G-forces. They could overlay their runs on a computer screen and see exactly what the car was doing at every inch of the track. They could see if the tires slipped on the launch. They could see if the converter was too loose. It was aerospace engineering applied to a drag strip. And it all started with a $5 part from a junked Oldsmobile. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of how a modern throttle stop system actually functions, because the engineering here is genuinely fascinating. We aren't talking about a simple on-off switch anymore. We're talking about fluid dynamics and precise airflow management. Today's top-tier throttle stops use high-speed stepper motors, similar to what you'd find in a CNC machine or a 3D printer. These motors can position the throttle blade to within 0.1% of accuracy, and they can do it hundreds of times per second. The installation is deceptive. It looks like a simple spacer plate that sits under the carburetor, maybe an inch thick. Inside that plate is a butterfly valve on a shaft. When the system is inactive, the valve is wide open, parallel to the airflow. You get full power. But when the timer triggers, that butterfly slams shut to a pre-programmed angle. It doesn't just close, it moves to a precise degree, maybe 42 degrees for a hot day or 38 degrees for a cool night. The air trying to rush into the engine hits this restriction, creating turbulence and dropping the manifold pressure instantly. The engine, which was screaming at 6,000 RPM, suddenly hits a brick wall of air. But here's where it gets really interesting. It's not just about restricting air, it's about managing the engine's recovery. You can't just snap the throttle back open instantly, or you might shock the tires and spin, ruining the run. So modern controllers allow for progressive throttle reapplication. You can program a curve. You can tell the butterflies to open from 30% to 100% over a span of 0.5 seconds. This smooths out the power delivery, keeping the chassis settled and the tires planted. It is traction control by another name, achieved solely through airflow management. The mathematics involved in setting these things up would make a high school calculus teacher sweat. Serious racers use computer modeling software that factors in everything: gear ratios, tire growth at speed, aerodynamic drag, converter slip, and even the track's elevation above sea level. You feed all these variables into a spreadsheet. The software spits out a prediction. It tells you, based on these conditions, if you want to run exactly in 8.90, you need to restrict the throttle for 2.145 seconds.
And notice I said based on these conditions. That is the killer variable: weather. In bracket racing, the atmosphere is your enemy. Air density changes constantly. As the sun goes down, the air gets cooler and denser, making more power. As humidity rises, the water vapor displaces oxygen, making less power. We aren't just looking at temperature, we're looking at grains of water and density altitude. A change of just 50 feet in density altitude, which can happen in 10 minutes if a cloud rolls in, can speed up or slow down a car by 1/100th of a second. In a sport decided by thousandths, that is the difference between winning $5,000 and going home broke. So the modern throttle stop racer has a weather station in their trailer that looks like something from NASA. It's constantly sampling the air. Some high-end throttle stop controllers even have sensors mounted on the car that sample the air in real time during the run and adjust the timer on the fly. Think about that. The car is driving itself, adjusting its own strategy while doing 160 miles per hour based on the humidity it tastes in the air scoop. This level of precision created a new problem: the stutter. When you restrict a massive racing engine, say a 500 cubic inch big block, it doesn't like it. It wants to breathe. When the stop engages, the air-fuel mixture goes crazy. The fuel is still being dumped in by the jets, but the air is cut off. The mixture goes incredibly rich. The engine starts to load up, sputtering and popping. To combat this, racers had to become carb tuning wizards. They started drilling holes in butterfly plates, modifying air bleeds, and changing emulsion tubes just to make the engine run cleanly while it was being choked to death. You essentially have to tune the engine to run well in two completely different states: wide open screaming power and part throttle cruising. It's a nightmare compromise. And then there is the strategy of the chase. Because throttle stop cars are often much faster than their dial-in suggests, they are almost always the chaser. Let's say you are running Super Comp, which is an 8.90 index class. Everyone has to run 8.90.
but your car is actually capable of running 7s. So you use the throttle stop to kill a massive amount of time, maybe 3 seconds. You launch, the stop hits, and you watch your opponent, who might be in a slower car with less throttle stop duration, drive away from you. You might be 300 feet behind them at half track. This is psychological torture. You are sitting in a car that feels like it's broken, watching the other guy win. You have to trust the math. You have to trust that when that timer clicks off, your 1,200 horsepower will be enough to run him down. And when it does release, it is violent. The G-force slams you back into the seat. The engine note changes from a dull drone to a deafening roar. You start closing on the other car at a rate of 20 or 30 miles per hour faster than they are moving.
This brings us to the dump. This is the most controversial move in bracket racing. Because you are closing so fast, it is very easy to misjudge the finish line and break out, go too fast. So experienced throttle stop racers will often set their cars up to run too fast on purpose. They might set the car up to run an 8.85 on the 8.90 index. Why? Because it's easier to slow down than speed up. They catch the other guy right before the finish line and then wham, they stomp on the brake pedal or whoomp the throttle, lift and get back on, to kill that last bit of momentum and cross the line right at 8.90. To a spectator, it looks insane. You see two cars screaming toward the finish, and suddenly the faster one emits a puff of tire smoke as the driver locks up the brakes at 150 miles per hour just inches from the line. It is a game of chicken played at lethal speeds, and it is all made possible and necessary by the throttle stop. If you didn't have the stop, you couldn't build the excess speed needed to play that game. This driving style, launch, stop, chase, dump, is what purists hate. They say it turns a drag race into a math equation. They say it looks ugly. And honestly, they have a point. Watching a dragster launch hard, fall on its face for 2 seconds, and then take off again isn't exactly the most visually exciting thing in the world. It looks broken, but it is undeniably effective. The safety aspect is also something we have to talk about because it gets scary. When you have these massive closing speeds, things go wrong. A throttle stop car is often a blind car. The driver is strapped in low with a giant engine scoop in front of them. When they are chasing down a slower door slammer car, they might be in the other driver's blind spot. And because they are closing so fast, the slower driver might not even know they are there until zoom, they blow past. There have been accidents. Bad ones. Cars drifting out of their groove, drivers misjudging the gap. The tracks had to adapt. Shut down areas, the space after the finish line where you slow down, had to be lengthened or reinforced with sand traps and catch nets. Why? Because a throttle stop car might cross the finish line doing 170 miles per hour, even though it only ran an 8-second elapsed time. A normal 8-second car might only be doing 150. That extra 20 miles per hour means you need a lot more room to stop. Brake rotors had to get bigger, parachutes became mandatory on cars that purely by elapsed time shouldn't have needed them. The kinetic energy involved is massive. And let's not forget the cost of failure. If your throttle stop fails to open, you just became a very expensive, very slow-moving roadblock. If it fails to close, you are now a missile headed for a guaranteed breakout and possibly the sand trap if you aren't paying attention. The reliability of these systems has improved, but in the harsh environment of a race car, vibration, heat, G-forces, electronics are always the weak link. A loose ground wire can cost you a national championship. This technology also birthed a new type of mechanic, the system specialist. It used to be you needed an engine guy and a chassis guy. Now you need a wiring guy. You need someone who understands reluctance sensors and duty cycles. The pits at a modern super comp race look more like a computer lab than a garage. You see guys staring at graphs on laptops, analyzing the shape of their throttle curve. Oh, we have a little dip in the G-meter at 2 seconds out. Maybe the stop is opening too aggressively. It is data-driven racing at the grassroots level. But despite all the tech, the core skill hasn't been eliminated. It has just shifted. The driver isn't managing traction with his foot anymore. He's managing the race with his brain. He has to have the situational awareness to know where he is on the track, where his opponent is, and whether his strategy's working. All in a span of 8 seconds. It is a high-speed chess match.
And if you ask any of the top racers, they will tell you it is harder now than it ever was. Because when everyone has a throttle stop, the margin for error is zero. You can't just be good, you have to be perfect. The machine gives you consistency, but it gives your opponent consistency too. So now, races are decided by who can cut a better reaction time. 00 lights are the standard, and who can play the finish line game better. Here's the thing about revolutions. They usually start with a specific problem, but they end up changing the entire economy of a sport. The throttle stop didn't just change how cars were driven, it changed who could afford to drive them. In the beginning, that $50 solenoid was the great equalizer. It allowed a kid with a junkyard part to beat a guy with a $20,000 race operation. It was a democratization of speed. But as the technology matured, that dynamic flipped. The arms race for the perfect throttle stop system meant that to be competitive in the top classes, Super Comp, Super Gas, Super Street, you needed the best equipment. You needed the programmable controller, the CO2 bottle, the weather station, the data logger, and the laptop to run it all. Suddenly, the budget bracket racer was priced out of the very classes that were designed for him. This created a schism in drag racing that still exists today. You have the box classes and the no-box classes. Box refers to the delay box and throttle stop electronics. These are the classes where technology rules. No box is where the foot breakers went. They retreated to their own ecosystem where human reflex is still the primary variable. And frankly, the no-box racers look at the throttle stop guys with a mix of disdain and pity. They see them as technicians, not drivers. But the throttle stop guys, they see themselves as the Formula One of grassroots racing. They are pushing the limits of consistency. They are chasing the perfect run, the 00 lights, and the dead-on index. Let's talk about those indexes for a second, because this is where the throttle stop really found its permanent home. The NHRA created specific classes around this technology: Super Comp, running on an 8.90 index, and Super Gas, 9.90. In these classes, virtually every single car has a throttle stop. It is a requirement to be competitive. If you show up to a Super Comp race without one, you're bringing a knife to a nuclear war. These classes became the testing ground for future automotive engineers. The kids who grew up tuning these systems in the 90s are the same people who are now designing the traction control and launch control systems for production cars at Ford, GM, and Ferrari. And that is a connection most people miss. The throttle stop was arguably the first widespread use of drive-by-wire philosophy in automotive history. Think about it. Before 1987, the connection between your foot and the engine was sacred. A cable, a mechanical linkage. If you pushed, it opened. The throttle stop broke that link. It was the first time a machine was given the authority to override the driver's input for the sake of performance. Today, almost every new car on the road has an electronic throttle. The computer decides how much power to give you based on traction, stability, and emissions. That concept, that the computer can drive better than you, started on a drag strip in Indiana with a vacuum solenoid. Our 18-year-old inventor, the kid who started it all, is in his late 50s now. He still lives in Indiana, he still messes around with cars, he runs a small performance shop, building engines and, yes, tuning throttle stops. He never became a millionaire from his invention. He never got a patent royalty check from the big companies that industrialized his idea. But in interviews, he doesn't seem bitter. He seems amused. He looks at the massive, multi-million-dollar haulers at national events, filled with cars running his concept, and he just smiles. He knows that he solved the problem that the experts said couldn't be solved. He knows that he forced an entire sport to rewrite its rulebook because he was too stubborn to lift his foot off the gas. There is a profound lesson in that. Innovation rarely comes from the people who are winning. The veterans, the guys with the fast cars and the big budgets, they didn't want throttle stops. They were happy with the status quo because the status quo favored them. Innovation comes from the frustrated. It comes from the kid in the beat-up Camaro who is tired of losing and decides to change the rules of the game. He didn't try to become a better foot breaker. He realized that foot braking was a flawed system and he automated it. He solved the problem by changing the problem. So, where does that leave us? Is the throttle stop a brilliant piece of engineering, or is it a cheat code that ruined the purity of the sport? The answer, honestly, is both. It is brilliant because it works. It is cheating because it bypasses the human frailty that makes racing exciting. But isn't that what all racing technology does? We moved from manual transmissions to automatics, to dual-clutch gearboxes. We moved from carburetors to fuel injection. We moved from bias-ply tires to radials. Every single one of those steps removed the variable that the driver used to have to manage. The throttle stop is just the most visible and perhaps the most intrusive step in that evolution. Today's bracket racing would be unrecognizable to someone from 1986. It is faster, safer, and incredibly more precise, but it is also quieter in a way. The human drama of "will he lift in time" is gone, replaced by the digital certainty of a timer. But the tension is still there. It has just shifted. The tension now is in the preparation. It is in the strategy. It is in knowing that your opponent is just as perfect as you are, so you have to be even more perfect. You have to cut a light that starts with a 000. You have to predict the wind. You have to be a meteorologist, a mathematician, and a mechanic all at once. And maybe that is the ultimate legacy of the throttle stop. It didn't kill the skill in drag racing. It just changed what skills matter. It proved that in motorsports, as in life, the person who works smarter, who leverages the tools available to them, who questions the way it's always been done, is the one who ends up in the winner's circle. That kid from Indiana didn't just invent a gadget. He proved that the smartest solution is usually the one that admits a machine can do it better. So the next time you see a car launch hard, fall on its face, and then rocket to the finish line, don't just see a broken car or a boring race. See the invisible hand of a teenager from 1987 who looked at an AC solenoid and saw the future. See the code, the math, and the sheer audacity of trusting a circuit board with your life at 160 miles per hour. It might not be pure driving, but it is undeniably, spectacularly racing. What is your take on throttle stops? Are they a brilliant innovation that saved the sport, or are they electronic cheating that ruined the show? Have you ever raced with one, or have you ever lost to one? I want to hear your war stories. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this controversial piece of racing technology. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of grassroots racing innovation, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories about the inventions that changed motorsports forever. Until next time, keep those engines running and those minds thinking.